I'm rereading all of Stephen King's books, and this is one I consider the best. My favorite book is actually The Stand, but I think this is actually his best book, followed by The Green Mile. I think The Green Mile is pretty close to a perfect book. I'm going to go ahead and read the introduction here so I don't end up repeating myself too much. But this is After 11/22/63 by J. Wilburn. The plan is to reread all of Stephen King's works in the order that they were published. Richard Chismar of Cemetery Dance had the vision. I'm doing it because I'm a writer and I want to improve my fiction. I love Stephen King's stories. I think there is something to be learned through this process. You can also go back to the beginning and read Before Carrie or any of my other posts up through this one and beyond by checking out this link to the master list of all Stephen King posts. I'll put the main link to this article in the chat for anybody that's interested, and then you can follow that link to the master list if you want to see more. If not, then that's fine too. All right, I'm still convinced 11/22/63 is Stephen King's best novel. I read it with a little more scrutiny this time, and I knew the twists and turns before they came, but I firmly believe a first-time reader would enjoy this novel the best of all his works. The greatness of this novel is layered through all the phases of the story. It's a top-notch time travel novel. The book was dedicated to a new granddaughter in Stephen King's family, and come 2011 for Zelda Hey Honey. King, through his characters, speculates that conspiracy theories around the Kennedy assassination come from a lack of balance between JFK and Lee Harvey Oswald as a man. Oswald shouldn't have been able to win based on moral weight. It just wasn't right. And I think that's actually a good theory, that the fact that some guy like Oswald, who was small and possibly alone, could have taken out the president of the United States just doesn't make sense. So a lot of people try for the conspiracy theories. I'm not getting into arguments about them, but I am saying that this is an interesting take that kind of explains why people want to believe those conspiracy theories. And then same thing with other theories that come along. We feel like there's an imbalance that can only be explained by this vast conspiracy. And that's why it somehow makes us more comfortable. Because living in a world where these random acts and lone gunmen can do these kind of things doesn't do well for us. In the afterword, he also speculates that the series of coincidences that led to Jack Ruby being there to assassinate Oswald eliminated the possibility of a trial for Oswald's last words being that he was a patsy for the crime, set up the conspiracy theory fodder for all time. King agrees with the lone gunman theory from the Warren Commission's conclusions. His wife believes there was more of a conspiracy. A lot of times the reason I think Oswald worked alone has to do with the Jack Ruby part, because Jack Ruby was kind of under the impression that Oswald had already been moved. And so he had actually stopped by like a Western Union and had sent money to one of the women that used to work for him that had moved away. And after that, he came into the garage. He was able to come in because the police knew him, and then realized he got there just as Oswald was being taken out. So the idea that Ruby was sent there specifically to assassinate him doesn't line up real well with the timeline. And so for me, that's kind of one of those things that shows these vast coincidences. So if he was really on a mission to take out Oswald, he probably wouldn't have stopped by Western Union and got there later than when Oswald was supposed to be moved. Okay, continuing on, in this actual novel set in sort of, for those of you that don't know, 11/22/63 is a time travel novel where a guy goes back in time essentially to try to stop the JFK assassination. There's more layers to it, and the nature of the time travel makes it difficult to pull the job off, and it's not one of those things where he can just travel back and forth however he feels. So in a way that makes the story more intriguing because of the limitations on the time traveler. We return to Derry in 1958 to right a wrong, but the whole town is wrong. Readers of it know there is a dark, murderous force below the city, and a veil of forgetfulness and selective blindness over most of the people who live there at this point in the town's history. You can tell right from the start this won't be good. Our main character gets a similar feeling upon entering 1960s Dallas, And King explains that Dallas wasn't a very nice place at the time that Kennedy made his fateful visit. King did exhaustive research for this, including tours of a number of locations. He paid to enter a few places not typically on the usual maps and used these in his story. This research led to rich detail that fills out the world of this story very, very well. Some of the things that contribute to it, I think, being his best novel. Our character in his searches of the past talks about being crippled by the internet. Hunting down a person or information in 1958 is a much tougher proposition than in 2011 and beyond. So he talks about how the character, talks about how used to he is of like, okay, I need to find an address, I just look it up. And then when he's in a town he doesn't know and is trying to find somebody's address that he doesn't know, it becomes almost impossible. Like he spends days and weeks trying to ask around and track people down, and the act of asking around kind of puts him under suspicion in his first attempt to correct something in Derry. King uses the word obdurate a lot in this novel to describe the resistance of history to being changed. The presence and actions of a time traveler trying to change things creates harmonics that cause echoes of events and people. A soft doubling of sorts that warns of bigger troubles to come. King used obdurate on occasion in a number of past novels. It's kind of one of his favorite words. Later, he said that he thought that Joe Hill suggested the word obdurate, but King used it all the time before that, so I don't know why he doesn't remember that. The Yellow Card Man is an interesting figure that hints at mysterious forces that are set to try to protect the past and the portals between time periods. But what powers do these boogeymen have? How many chances do you get? The fixed nature of the doorway between times adds urgency to each attempt to change the past in really powerful ways. King talks about easy credit terms as an analogy for the nature of life. He's used the phrase in more than one story. I forgot about the Florida stint of his journey to the past. So the time traveler has to come back a good bit before the actual date. He wants to change things for the Kennedy assassination, and so he has to spend a few years kind of living in the past. And there's one point where he goes to Florida, and that becomes kind of significant later. But I'd forgotten about that whole stint of where he was just trying to live out his life away from things for a little while. Explanations are such cheap poetry. That is a great line, and I love that from this story. He stays at the Hotel Monteleone in New Orleans. I was there for the World Horror Convention in 2013, shortly after I quit teaching to write full-time. The character writes a novel as a cover story, and then there is some confusion over when exactly he is writing the narrative that we are reading. Substitute teaching allows him some time off to visit Dallas as he settles into life in a small town outside the big city. Things get darker as he has to move closer to the action. Then there is a girl. There's always a girl, but this gives the story depth and personal stakes. It's a lovely relationship. The confrontation with her ex-husband is well written, but a bit anticlimactic in a confrontational sense. Still, the course that encounter takes is surprising and therefore a good story choice, in my opinion. He was robbed of his monstrous power, and it was a good turn. It gives our main character something to lose, something to fight for, something bigger than the history alone. So even though 11/22/63 by Stephen King is really about this guy trying to see if he can change history by stopping the Kennedy assassination, these personal stories of the people he meets and the people he tries to help and protect, that really is the heart of the story and makes it important. And even though at times it gets in the way of him trying to find out the things he needs to know to be sure that it really was Oswald that killed Kennedy, it makes sense that he's kind of pulled in more than one direction, and it does make for a great story. There is a great danger in honesty when you are a time traveler. Be careful not to sing songs not yet written, to use slang outside of the time period, or to predict things too accurately. The character talks to his dead friend in the long months alone to give him a foil to essentially argue with himself about some tough choices. King presents Lee Oswald's arc as sort of being wound up into the dangerous man he becomes. All the pieces are there for him to be troubled for him to be trouble all along, though. So King did it, making Lee Harvey Oswald a character in the story. King did a good job of giving him a character arc, of kind of underpinning who he was as a person, and the changes that went place that turned him into an assassin. The Cuban Missile Crisis hits everyone hard. With Cold War fears of nuclear war at their height, King compares the atmosphere to the psychological aftermath of 9/11. To the people in the dark valley of the present, it looks different than it did in history. So a lot of these things in the past we look back on in a historic sense, and King did a great job of capturing the fear and desperation of the moment that some of us experienced when we lived through events like 9/11 and other things like that. Never underestimate America's ability to accept fascism disguised as populism is a really powerful and prophetic line. He did it in this story as a way to kind of explain the dangerous politics of some of the characters there. But if you kind of think about some of the things that we struggle with philosophically today with our politics, it's kind of an interesting line that still resonates no matter which side of political debate you might be on. The Texas School Book Depository is treated like a haunted house or a cursed graveyard with a palpable presence and power. It is surrounded by dark magic in a sense without coming right out and saying that it is. So making that structure imposing and threatening, King did a really good job of that without having to resort to anything truly supernatural. You almost felt like it was a haunted house, but of course it was haunted by the history that was going to unfold there. The changes to history as a result of our character's action are interesting. There are consequences beyond the normal butterfly effect that cause all historic alterations, even ones meant for the good, to come at a very high cost, which of course, if this story is to mean anything, it should. The Takuro Spirit is the car of alternate realities in Stephen King's universe. One appears at a thin point between worlds in the narrative of Wizard and Glass from the Dark Tower series. So when King shows an alternate universe or an alternate timeline, that car and a certain type of soda and a few other things show up. Apparently, it was his son Joe Hill who suggested a better ending to the book, and I believe Joe was right about this one. It's one of King's best endings for his best novel. So the next one in the series was Before a Face in the Crowd, but right now I'm actually reading Dr. Sleep. So as of the time I'm recording this, Dr. Sleep is the novel I'm on, and that's an interesting one as well. So I look forward to telling you guys about that one. Typically, I do a before and after post for each of the stories that I read from Stephen King, each of the books, and those appear on Tuesdays and Thursdays on my blog. So I'll share that link one last time before we finish up here. I'm a huge fan of Stephen King, and even though in some of these I criticize some of his writing, as much, how nervy am I to criticize Stephen King when I'm at the level I'm at, but I kind of feel okay with doing that because I'm so positive on him as a writer. He is my favorite writer. He writes some of my favorite books, and so when I see things that aren't quite perfect, I feel okay in pointing those out because I think on the whole my reviews of most of his work are quite positive. Even if I did an article for Lit Reactor where I listed off my 10 least favorite Stephen King books and why I still love them. So even though I had criticisms of the books I like the least of his, I still had positive things to say about it. My goal is to be done with all his books right up through the latest one, Billy Summers, I believe it's called, by the end of this year. Then I'm going to reread all of Brian Keene's books in order, and hopefully definitely his books are shorter, so that's one advantage. My hope is to be done with those before the end of next year, but who knows. And I'm gathering all the books of Armand Rosamilia at this point, and I'll start on his books after that. So I really need to pick some less prolific writers or ones that aren't writing anymore, so that I can stay caught up. I'm looking at doing possibly Jack Ketchum's books at one point. He has a smaller catalog than any of those other three authors I named, and of course he's passed on, so I would be looking at his books. I'll have 37 new books by the time you get to mine. I wish you were kidding. Armand is a prolific writer and a very dear friend of mine. And I think he's becoming more of a dear friend of mine since I'm buying every single one of his books now. But I'm sure he'd still be my friend even if I wasn't doing that. But yes, he's a very prolific writer, so he's already got 4, 5, 6 books out this year. I actually had to confirm with him that I had down all the new books he released this year. I hadn't bought them all yet, but I wanted to be sure I had my list right so that when I did finish buying them all up, I'd have them all. But that's my plan. A lot of people kind of give me a hard time for reading that way. Now, of course, I read other books all the time, but I think there's something interesting about starting at the beginning of an author's career. And of course, you can't get every book, so there's some books that are out of print that you can't get. But everything that's available from the author's first book through to the present time, I've learned a lot about Stephen King's writing by doing that, his methods of storytelling. And as a writer, it's actually, I think, made me better at seeing things I need to fix, but then also picking up on just some cool tricks that make a story better. I'm hoping to get the same thing from reading all of Brian Keene's books and all of Armand Rosmelia's books.